There exists today a healthy amount of debate regarding the question of how wild was the real Old West. Some would argue that contrary to popular opinion, the Old West was relatively quiet and safe, with numerous judicial systems and peacekeeping organizations which stifled many instances of impending violence. For instance, in wagon trains, internal strife that would typically lead to murder in Western movies actually resulted simply in ostracizing or banishing the aggressor from the group. And while law and order was largely enforced by local militias in the early days of westward expansion across the territories of America, the official formation of government and a standing army further cemented a civil society we would be able to closely recognize by today's standards. That isn't to say that isolated yet major incidents of violence didn't take place, however. In fact, a large proportion of such incidents would go on to be romanticized and mythologized within America's past. One of the more well-known examples of violence in the Old West is the 1881 shootout at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, when lawman Wyatt Earp and his brothers exchanged gunfire with members of the Cowboys, a notorious group of outlaws. This real event went on to inspire numerous adaptations in literature and film. And then there are other examples of violence in the Old West, the kind similar to that which many today think of when imagining an immense, dangerous, and lawless land such as the fabled Wild West of America in its days of old. Such as the story of the Glanton Gang, a true horror in history. John Joel Glanton was born in the year 1819 in South Carolina. Soon after his birth, his father died, and his mother moved him and his siblings to Louisiana, where she met and married a wealthy war veteran. The family then moved to the Arkansas Territory, where they established a plantation and entered into the slave trade. As John Glanton grew older, he gained a notable penchant for having a bad temper. While little exists in the public civil records on Glanton, it is said that after a time spent in Tennessee, he fled the state as an outlaw and made his way further south to Gonzales, Texas, no doubt putting distance between himself and whatever misdeeds he may have committed. While in Gonzales, Glanton, then still a teenager, joined the fight for independence during the Texas Revolution in 1835. Before or during this time, it is not formally known, Glanton became engaged, though during the siege of San Antonio, his fiancée was abducted during a Lipan Apache raid, and tragically, she was scalped and executed by the war party. Glanton would become fully involved in the bloody battles that would erupt across Texas as the many settled Europeans and Hispanic Texans fought back against Mexico's centralizing government. The young soldier was made a captain of the Texas Rangers at the age of only 16, and narrowly escaped the Goliad Massacre, a marked defeat for the revolutionaries in the war. It is said that the Republic of Texas President Sam Houston banned Glanton from the state for unknown reasons, though his banishment was never enforced. However, Glanton did ultimately leave Texas, finding himself in Louisiana in 1841, where he appears in an officer's arrest report after firing his pistol at a policeman inside the American Theater in the city of New Orleans. But because no one was injured, Glanton was curiously released without charges. He then returned to Texas following the state's annexation and further westward expansion into Mexican territories, which sparked the Mexican-American War. Glanton signed on to the U.S. Army as a scout, performing exemplary acts of bravery such as assisting in clearing out guerrilla fighters in northern Mexico. While stationed as a sentry in New Mexico, Glanton shot and killed an unarmed Mexican citizen. He was tipped off by a fellow infantryman of his impending arrest, so he fled his unit, joining a contingent of Texas Rangers, where he showed further heroic acts in battle at the Guadalajara Pass in Mexico, making him a minor war hero. He was promoted to lieutenant and assigned to aiding in the fight against Native Americans on the Texas frontier. It was at this point, whether by pure opportunistic nature or disillusionment from his duties, Glanton and 30 armed gold seekers set out west for California, where the gold rush was just getting underway. Samuel Emery Chamberlain was born in 1829 in Center Harbor, New Hampshire. Soon after his birth, Chamberlain's family moved to Boston, Massachusetts, where he spent the majority of his childhood. But at the age of 15, the restless teenager unexpectedly ran away from his home in 1844 and settled in Illinois, where he joined the U.S. Army as a volunteer before marching to Texas to fight in the Mexican-American War. Arriving in San Antonio, he signed up with the 1st U.S. Dragoons as a cavalryman. He fought in many battles during the war, including the Battle of Buena Vista in February 1847. Though in 1849 he had been labeled as a deserter, and few other records on him exist until 1854, upon his return home to Boston. But according to Samuel Chamberlain himself, his story did not end in the American Southwest in Mexico, following his service in the military. On the contrary, Chamberlain claimed that he was involved in darker deeds along the border, joining an outfit of mercenaries led by none other than the notorious John Glanton. Chamberlain's testaments to his experiences with the Glanton Gang is the only known first-hand account of the gang's true nature, a nature so vile and twisted that even those who would conduct immoral business with them would eventually themselves condemn the gang for their horrendous exploits. Centuries ago, between 1200 and 1500 AD, a nomadic people is believed to have traveled south from the Pacific Northwest, though their exact origin is still debated. Settling in what is now the Sonora Desert region of Southwest America and northern Mexico, they refer to themselves as Inda, or the people. Being nomadic, they believed the lands around them would provide them with what they required, so staples of societal norms such as agriculture and animal husbandry were not relied upon. When Spanish conquistadors first encountered these people in the 16th century, they referred to them as the Apache, some translations dictating the word to mean Navajos or enemy, though the exact meaning remains uncertain among experts. Though the Apache lived in relative peace, their beliefs in procurement of resources from the land surrounding them didn't stop at the resources belonging to their neighbors, which included other Native American tribes. Once the Spanish arrived with horses, the Apache found these new mounts to enable swift and more efficient raids and resource gathering. And while the term raid can often be synonymous with violence, with such examples as raids by the Norse peoples during the Viking Age, Apache raids were carried out with stealth as a top priority. However, should they meet resistance from those they were raiding, there was little hesitation in fighting should they have the advantage. As the centuries went on, and Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821, Mexican settlers in addition to Anglo migrants began to crowd their way into the Apache territory. And as the Apache continued with their traditional practices of raiding, the Mexican government took notice. Following skirmishes between Mexican settlers and the Apache, along with the continued escalation of raids, Mexico's government knew it needed to take action. So began a brutal and savage business on the border. In 1849, John Glanton was leading his gold-seeking company along the Chihuahua route to California, when they found themselves depleted of supplies and money, effectively halting the expedition altogether in Mexico. Strapped for cash, the men found a beneficial relationship in 27-year-old Texas Ranger Michael A. Chevalier. Chevalier had taken part in many battles against Mexican guerrillas during the War for Texas Independence and the Mexican-American War. Chevalier and Glanton were able to influence the Mexican government in passing the Fifth Law while in Chihuahua City, allowing them the ability to contract along with local guerrillas for bounties, the bounties being the scalps or live capture of Apache Indians, including women and children. The going rates for these scalps or captives were set at 250 pesos for the capture of male warriors over 14 years old, nearly $600 today, 200 pesos for male warrior scalps, 150 pesos for female captives of any age, and 150 pesos for children. Furthermore, in special cases, exorbitant prices were set on the heads of specific Apache warriors, up to a staggering 1,000 pesos, ensuring that scalp hunters could make a quick fortune in the deplorable trade. These conditions all but drove violent and greedy men like John Glanton into a feverish pitch, with others traveling far to the Sonora Desert, such as freed slaves or even other Native Americans, including the Seminoles all the way from Florida, with such diverse individuals even joining with Glanton himself. Initially, this lucrative business for sordid types such as Glanton was met with backlash in Chihuahua. Many believed that contracts being made with Anglo-Texas Rangers and other mercenary types was in secret a devious imperialistic plan meant to infiltrate deeper into Mexico, with aims of further expanding the newly independent Texas border following the war. But the passage of the Fifth Law was not the first occurrence of scalp hunting on either side of the border. Both Anglo-Americans and Mexican citizens have been involved in the scalp trade in the area before. But this new bounty contract from the Mexican government meant to subdue native raiding, in fact had the opposite effect. Both Apache and Comanche tribes were furious over the scalp hunters, and instead of lying low, raiding in the region exploded across Mexico, from the Gulf Coast in the east, all the way to the Pacific Ocean in the west. And further retaliation saw the Comanche turn to beheading defeated scalp hunters, with one chieftain offering bounties of his own on their heads. As the situation grew more chaotic, opposing sides found themselves forming unlikely alliances. Some Mexican renegades, for example, actually worked with native tribes. Posing as scalp hunters, these seedy opportunists engaged in their own raids, pillaging and robbing their own people. The summer of 1849 would be an especially bloody one. Atrocities were being traded back and forth by both sides. The Apache were grouping in larger war parties, with focus shifting from raids born out of perceived necessity to vindictive attacks that left Mexican citizens dead, sometimes in their own doorways. Some of these attacks took place just a few miles from the governor's own well-fortified palace, spurring some like gold-seeking 49er George Evans to speak out. "The whole country seems to be governed by the Apache nation, and those pretending to rule dare not say that they are masters." The fall and winter of 1849 saw many futile attempts in the scalp hunting business. The Apache and Comanche easily covered their tracks following raids, wherein they would return to their mountain hideouts, leaving the Mexican and American scalpers with little to show for their efforts. In fact, many would say that the several months preceding the enactment of the Fifth Law saw little difference in the frequency of Indian raids prior to the law's passing. The Apache and Comanche, on the other hand, saw no reason to abandon their efforts in plundering the resource-rich lands. By 1850, many American 49ers who had put on pause their journey west to gold-laden California became satisfied enough with their handsome bounty payouts, and therefore continued on to their initially conceived destinations. Other scalp hunters, weary from long pursuits of the hostile native tribes, simply lost interest in the brutal scalp business. Though there were some scalp hunters who held on, their greed for violence and wealth still unsatisfied. John Glanton's gang was one such company of killers. While the end of 1849 saw the Fifth Law's massive scalp hunt dry up, the Glanton Gang pressed on with their dark efforts. Whether by a lust for bloodshed or a ravenous greed, it made no difference. John Glanton and his gang would go on to perform particularly atrocious acts upon the Apache and citizens of Mexico alike. They'd abandoned all notion of their original mission, the search for gold in California. What took over instead was a storm of malevolence that would ultimately be their end. One figure in Glanton's gang who seemed especially intent on sowing hatred upon others was a man known only as Judge Holden of Texas, or simply the Judge. An individual described as so vile that their persona exists today in infamy. In 1985, a novel was published by American author Cormac McCarthy, who just recently passed away at the age of 89 as of this recording. The novel, Blood Meridian, or The Evening Redness in the West, is a fictional retelling of the Glanton Gang's murderous spree across Mexico and the American Southwest. In McCarthy's story, a teenager joins the bloodthirsty Glanton Gang where he meets Judge Holden, whose evil deeds make all others pale in comparison. In reality, the only account of the judge is by that of Samuel Chamberlain. In his autobiographical book, My Confession, Recollections of a Rogue, Chamberlain describes Judge Holden as a large man, 6'6" in height, clad in moccasins, his face tallow and dull, devoid of any hair and expression. Where his appearance was lacking, the judge made up for it in what Chamberlain described as a sort of genius. The scalp hunter seemed capable of conversing with others in any language of their choosing, including several Native American lingos. He could outplay any instrumentalist, and often did when commandeering a harp or guitar at performances. His aptitude for dancing was unmatched by any other the gang encountered. He was, as Chamberlain put, plumb center with any rifle or pistol, an expert horseman, and on top of it all, a very well-educated man, with a scholarly knowledge of all the botanicals and their scientific names, along with also being well-versed in mineralogy and geology. Chamberlain witnessed firsthand a horrid act by Judge Holden, while the Glanton Gang took refuge in a small town. There, the body of a 10-year-old girl was found discarded in the brush, and her throat was bruised and imprinted with the shape of a large hand. No one would openly say as much, though all around knew that no one else possessed such hands as those of the judge. Chamberlain recounts that he hated the man upon first sight, and that Judge Holden knew this. However, he goes on to say that the judge only ever spoke to him cordially and with great interest, and that when the topic of Chamberlain's home of Boston, Massachusetts came up, the judge surprised the young Bostonian with his superior knowledge of the city and area. While many would-be scalp hunters finally decided to pick up stakes and leave the once lucrative scalp trade by 1850, as the increasingly elusive and dangerous Apache ran the scalpers ragged across the Sonora Desert, John Glanton and his murderous gang had other ideas. Instead of abandoning the prospect of trading Apache scalps for cash, the Glanton Gang turned their skinning knives on peaceful agrarian Native American settlements. When they became satisfied with their profits, they focused their efforts on the local Mexican populace, seeing no difference between a dark-haired Mexican scalp and that of a dark Apache scalp. The Glanton Gang reasoned that the Mexican government would find no difference either. Scalping and murdering indiscriminately, the Glanton Gang no longer concerned themselves with the stipulations of the Fifth Law. They'd become insatiably greedy and bloodthirsty, and would often drink excessively, along with kidnapping women for their more carnal desires. It did not take long, however, for the Mexican government to realize the horrible depths the Glanton Gang had descended to for profit. The Chihuahua authorities severed their contract with Glanton and his men and drove them out of the territory, placing a bounty of nearly $250,000 in today's currency on the scalp of John Glanton himself. The gang fled north into Arizona, where they came to the Colorado River, meeting a wealthy ferry operator. The desperados forced the ferry owner into a business partnership through intimidation, and then commandeered the entire operation, chasing off the original owner. Now the sole proprietors, they would occasionally murder and rob Mexicans and Americans alike, who used the ferry to travel established 49er routes, going to and coming from California, where gold was plentiful. For those lucky enough to escape with their lives, they were charged nearly 10 times the amount of the previous fares. A few miles up the river, a neighboring ferry operated under the ownership of Yuma Indians. Glanton is said to have personally insulted their chief, and rumors speculate that his gang actually carried out an attack on the Yuma ferry as well, killing some Yuma men and kidnapping 9 Yuma women, according to Samuel Chamberlain. The Yuma, an inherently peaceful tribe, initially chose not to retaliate, though they would convene, holding serious discussions over how long they should endure the Glanton Gang's terror without a response. A week would pass as the outlaws continued to hole up at the ferry crossing, even going so far as to hastily construct a makeshift fort in the area. Their occupation of the river crossing was shaping up to be an extended one, possibly permanent. The Yuma knew they needed to act. One day, around noon, as much of the gang were having a siesta in the shade, out of the hot southwestern sun, Chamberlain stated that he and 3 other gang members were by the river, gathering their belongings, all in agreement that they had seen enough violence and were ready to leave. At this point, a full-scale attack on the gang was launched by the Yuma. Chamberlain and his fellow disillusioned brigands saddled up and took off towards the California desert, escaping the slaughter. The rest of the gang was caught totally by surprise, being cut down and scalped. A number of accounts differ as to John Glanton's particular fate, though some say he was clubbed to death, while others attest to him having his throat slit and his scalp removed, with yet another recollection contending that a young Yuma Indian split Glanton's skull with a tomahawk. The Yuma then lashed Glanton to the carcass of a dog and burned him, the volatile, ungodly gang leader from South Carolina, meeting a fitting, horrible end on the Mexican border, where so much blood was spilled by his hand. As to Glanton's second-in-command, Judge Holden of Texas, some sources say he likely died with the rest of the men at the river, though Chamberlain states in his book that the judge also escaped and they found him in the desert being chased by another native tribe. They rescued Holden, whereafter he stole one of their horses and made off with it. The next night, Holden turned up at their campfire and had supposedly killed one of their mules. Chamberlain and the others found the large man roasting pieces of it over the fire. A secret discussion was had about killing the judge, but cooler heads prevailed, and they instead left him the next morning, neither hearing nor seeing of the black-hearted scalp hunter ever again. Samuel Chamberlain and his fellow scalp hunters made it to Los Angeles, where they alerted the authorities of the Glanton Gang massacre. Recognizing the dangerous and lawless conditions on the United States' new border with Mexico, the government sent troops to keep the peace. After a few years in California, Chamberlain returned to his home in Boston, where he married and raised a family. He would go on to serve as a general on the Union side during the Civil War, and as a veteran of 2 major wars in U.S. history, he eventually retired from his military life and became a prison warden in Massachusetts and Connecticut. He also became known for his art, having created paintings that depict his tumultuous life during the Mexican-American War, some of which are showcased in this video. The years between 1855 and 1861 are the years when Chamberlain is thought to have penned his autobiography, My Confession, the basis of which inspired author Cormac McCarthy to write his magnum opus, Blood Meridian, which has recently been picked up by Hollywood to become a feature-length film. Though fans of the book have proclaimed their expressed concern of the adaptable nature, or lack thereof, of McCarthy's gruesomely violent story, arguing that no major movie studio could ever hope to translate the graphic imagery and prose of Blood Meridian to the big screen, making any attempt futile. Time will tell if Hollywood will take the bold approach of capturing an authentic visual take on McCarthy's retelling of the atrocities committed by the infamous Glanton Gang story, a tale of American violence that is almost too hard to swallow as being historical fact. But such a tale is indeed just that, making the Glanton Gang a true horror in history. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more videos like this one, especially if you are a new viewer. Thanks for watching Horrors in History.